We are really excited. I'm Florence Miles. For a start, I'm the director of this new centre in language development throughout the lifespan, or LADLI as we call it. Thank you very much for coming. Some of you have travelled quite far, we know, and the great thing is people have come from many different disciplines. So there's people from speech and language therapy, teachers, as well as other researchers from other universities, from other departments in this university, and this is great. This is exactly the purpose of the centre. So we're really excited. It's a great day, a great space. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, which you know about, because that's why you're here. So we're really looking forward to the day. We're also very grateful to the university for enabling us to launch this new centre, which is quite unique in the UK in bringing researchers together who work on language development right from birth to end of life, with all stages in between. So the purpose of the centre is to strengthen existing links we have amongst ourselves, links with other departments, other researchers in the UK and internationally, other research centres, as well as, very importantly, practitioners. So discuss our research with practitioners for whom it matters, shape our research through this dialogue. So teachers, speech and language therapists, parents, etc., anybody who has an interest in language development. So there are three main areas in the centre, which is the focus of our activities. So early language development in childhood, both monolingual, bilingual and multilingual. Second language acquisition, learning and teaching, which is quite a big part of what we do. And then language loss, aging and impairment is also a focus. So the way we've organized the day reflects that. We're going to have a keynote on each of these three areas, so early language development, L2 learning and teaching, and language loss and aging and impairment. After each keynote, we will give a very short presentation of the research we do at Essex in each of those areas, just so that you get a sense of the type of research we are engaged in and see what links you might want to build with us. So I think that's all I wanted to say. A big welcome to everybody. It's great to see you here, and enjoy the day. As you know, there will be lunch served in the middle of the day, as well as a reception at between 4 and 5, where the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Research for the university will officially open the centre. Thank you, everyone. So we will now start with the first keynote with Professor Stephen Crain, who needs no introduction, but Sonia will introduce him.
It's a great pleasure to have Stephen Crain here. Florence? It's not working. To have Stephen Crain here, who is the head of a Center for Cognition and Disorders in Macquarie University. So he came all the way from Australia, Sydney, all the way to here, being 12 hours ahead of us, still on his time schedule. So we're very grateful that you made this long trip. Stephen works on language acquisition, on child language acquisition, but also on language processing and on neurocognition. So there is an interesting match to the center. And he also has a long history of creating and running centers that focus on these areas that we are interested in as well, both in Connecticut and in Maryland. You had similar centers. And you will see in his talk that he combines very different aspects of linguistics and psycho and neurolinguistics. So on the one hand, he has a formal logic and computational background, and on the other hand, he's a magician in getting children to talk. So I've seen that live in the lab as a PhD student, and that was one of the things that got me hooked on that field, to see how he can get very small children to actually produce the most amazing constructions that you wouldn't think a 2 or 3-year-old is capable of. So you'll see some of this today. And you can also see how he combines that ability and talent with the interest in the more logical foundations of language. And he will argue for a strong role of innate predispositions for language learning, so nature playing a significant role in language acquisition, not just nurture. So we're keen to hear more from you, not from me. So we welcome you, and I hand this over to you.
Thanks.
It's all switched.
As the director of a center very similar in spirit to this one, I think you have a big advantage over the center that I'm currently the director of, because you already have brought together a lot of people who are interested in cross-disciplinary research. That's one of the most difficult things for a center director, is to get people to work together. So I actually have a scheme that I developed where I will not fund research unless it involves 2 people from different programs within my center. And I know money is not the best message, but it sometimes is the message that works. I'm happy to hear that Essex is 50 years old as a university. Macquarie is actually 50 years old. And it turns out that Noam Chomsky's book, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, is 50 years old this year. And I'd like to bring us back a little bit to that book. Now, there have been a number of challenges that have been posed to this theory of universal grammar. I'm going to assume that you've all heard of this theory and know about Noam Chomsky's work. I like to characterize these as arguments against mom. Of course, no one would really want to argue against mom, but there are some arguments that have been levied against this theory of universal grammar, especially very recently. So in the past, there have been arguments against modularity of mind, and so the famous book by Jerry Fodor in 1983, The Modularity of Mind, was, took up the banner to argue that there was a special language faculty, and of course that has been challenged even recently. But there's a new argument that I'd like to take up today. So when I first got the invitation, I didn't really know what I was going to talk about, but lots of friends and colleagues encouraged me to take up this argument against what I call more than one method, and I'll explain that to you. But even as recently as 2010, people have argued against modularity. So here's a quote from Enfield in Science magazine: "Language is entirely grounded in a constellation of cognitive capacities that each taken separately has other functions as well. So there's no such thing as language except as an arbitrary complex of independent cognitive processes." And this is the horizontal faculty psychology that Jerry Fodor was arguing against in his famous book, Modularity of Mind, in 1983. So what Fodor argued is that he argued for a vertical faculty psychology in which there are faculties that are domain-specific, genetically determined, and associated with distinct neural structures, and most famously, they're computationally autonomous. And he has this nice quote about a perceptual system for a language comes to be viewed as containing quite an elaborate theory of the objects in its domain, perhaps a theory couched in the form of a grammar of the language. And the evidence for modularity of mind, of course, is the evidence that our beliefs about what the world is like, or our wishes about what the world is like, our desires, and so on, does not influence our perception. So we perceive language just like we perceived this pencil to be bent in water, we can't help but perceive it to be bent in water, even though we know for a fact that if we lift the pencil out of the water, then it's going to be a straight pencil. So the same thing was, the same idea was elaborated in Fodor's book. But I want to talk about this more recent challenge to universal grammar as a theory of language acquisition. So when I wrote the abstract for this conference, I was trying just to put my thoughts down on paper. I had never really thought about how I was going to respond to this particular critique of universal grammar. So I just started writing, and that's why my abstract, I'm sorry it's so long. It's just so long because I was working this out myself. But the basic idea I have is the same as on these overheads. So the idea is that there's a theory, an alternative to universal grammar, and it's called information structure. And it's on a par with universal grammar. That is, it can account for everything that universal grammar can account for, including the things that linguists like myself attribute to abstract syntactic and semantic knowledge. So it's able to explain all those things. Now, in addition, it can explain more than those things that we mistakenly invoke abstract syntactic and semantic principles to explain, because everyone concedes that we need principles of information structure to account for certain facts about how adults process language, and there is no doubt that that's correct. One can question the first premise, whether information structure accounts for exactly the same amount as theory of universal grammar. I'm going to set that aside because I want to take up the challenge in another direction. But if these two premises are correct, then information structure provides a more parsimonious account of the knowledge that we have as adults when we are using our language. So the theory of universal grammar is redundant at best. Now, what's this have to do with first language acquisition? Well, the argument continues that children have been found to adhere to constraints on information structure by age 3, and that's the age at which people like me have claimed that children are adhering to principles of syntax and semantics. Well, they're also adhering, if the argument goes, to principles of information structure, and therefore children's acquisition of adult-like linguistic behavior is more parsimoniously explained by a theory of information structure. So if it can explain, as a theory of information structure can explain everything that the theory of universal grammar can explain, and children acquire the abilities to process information structure at 3 years old, then there's no need to explain the child's emerging linguistic competence using theory of universal grammar. So this is what we attempted to demonstrate. So I'll talk a little bit about the theory in more detail, but basically I want to take up the challenge in a particular direction. What I think that this argument overlooks or sidesteps, as I said in the abstract, is that it's a theory of when children are developing language normally, when children are adhering to the same principles, be they universal grammar or information structure, as adults are adhering to when they process language. But that's not always the case. So sometimes children's linguistic behavior differs from that of adults. And a lot of people have suggested, including me, that the differences between child language and adult language is another way to look at and identify the natural seams of human languages. So there are dissociations, not just dissociations of faculties in vertical faculty psychology, as Fodor has suggested, but there are dissociations between child and adult language. And these dissociations, these differences between how children are acquiring their first language and how adults are using the language that they acquired, these provide very compelling evidence for the theory of universal grammar, and they don't provide compelling evidence for theory of information structure. So I want to talk about two such examples of differences between child language and adult language in this brief talk today. I want to talk about some cross-linguistic variation from my own laboratory, and then I want to talk about the importance of the study of specific language impairment when children have language disorders as a way of investigating the natural seams of human languages. The conclusion I want to reach is that it does take more than one method. In fact, so this is a defense of mom for children to acquire their mother tongue. So I want to get a little bit into logic, and I hope that this is a very informal introduction to some of these logical principles. I'm going to keep it very, very informal and have a lot of diagrams. But the one thing that I want to do is to talk about not just English, because I think we've been misled a lot by the investigation of Indo-European languages into thinking that that's how languages, that's how human languages are. And often it's more revealing if you look at typologically distant languages. So I've been doing a lot of research on Mandarin Chinese since I moved to Australia, so I'll talk about some of the research on Mandarin Chinese. So one of the bonuses of attending this talk is that you get to learn something about Mandarin Chinese, at least 3 or 4 words, and some of the astounding differences between Mandarin Chinese. Actually, there are differences that cut across wide ranges of different languages. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something called scope, because I think that scope actually explains these differences in a very precise and elegant way. And the children's initial scope assignments actually conform a lot to the sort of ideas of language acquisition that Chomsky put forward 50 years ago this year in his first chapter of Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. If you haven't read the first chapter of Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, it's something I really recommend that you read. Not for its sort of accuracy of content and forecasting the future, but for its attempt to give a constructive and articulated theory of how languages, the study of human language and the study of syntax is psychologically real, is a psychologically viable study. So lots of other theories of human language have very little contact to how human languages are learned by children. But this has always been the goal, the aim of the theory of universal grammar. And I think that's what makes it so exciting to work within this theoretical framework. Of course, I don't do syntax anymore. I just study the logical development of human languages by children, and that's what I want to discuss now. And then I'll turn briefly to specific language impairment, because again, I think that's very informative about how children can differ from adults, but not in ways that are predicted by information theory. Now, what's very interesting, and what I didn't realize until I started to study Mandarin Chinese when I moved to Australia 10 years ago, is that when we have 2 logical expressions, all human languages are open to certain scope ambiguities. I'll give you some examples in a second. But some languages prefer one interpretation and other languages prefer another interpretation. And that's quite interesting that you can get these cross-linguistic differences, and I'll give you examples of these differences. So what are scope ambiguities? As I say, I don't want to get into the technical details, but you're all familiar with scope ambiguities just from your everyday experience. So here are 3 scope ambiguities. Now, as usual, speakers of human languages come up with a favored interpretation when they read one of these things. If you say all airplanes do not carry pets, then the interpretation that you favor is one in which not all airplanes carry pets. So it's not expected. When I moved my dog from the United States to Australia, I looked to see whether I could put my dog on an airplane, and I saw a sign at Logan Airport that says all airplanes do not carry pets. And I was not discouraged by that sign, thinking that it meant my dog's not going to possibly go on an airplane, because I know that even though it says all airplanes do not carry pets, what they really mean is not all airplanes carry pets. The next example is from the movie Roxanne with Steve Martin and Daryl Hannah. He says there's a perfect tool for every job, and he pulls out a credit card. Okay, so you thought there might be a different tool for each job, but there's one tool that's perfect for every job, namely a credit card. Or another joke that's just in the newspaper, a man falls down a flight of stairs every 9 minutes. His name is Norbert. Okay, so these are the kind of things, these are unexpected because they have two logical words, every and a man, or every job and all and negation and so on. And you get two different interpretations, and one of them is strongly favored. But what I want to introduce to you is a place in which human languages resolve scope ambiguities in different ways. So the favored interpretation in Mandarin Chinese is different from the favored interpretation in German or in English or in Korean. So there are lots and lots of languages that work like Mandarin Chinese and lots of languages that work like English, but they work in the opposite way. Okay? And these are fully crossed, so you can find other phenomena. I won't have time to talk about more than one phenomena, so I'll introduce that now. And this uses disjunction words like or in English or huojia in Mandarin Chinese. So sometimes when you have disjunction and you have another logical operator, say negation, then there can be ambiguity. There's room for ambiguity, and disjunction is interpreted differently when it's interpreted in sentences with negation in different languages. Okay, so English first. English is pretty straightforward. If you say John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, then it follows that John didn't bring beer to the party and John didn't bring wine to the party. So if you recall your very elementary propositional logic, and there's De Morgan's laws, which says not A or B is logically equivalent to not A and not B. Well, English works this way in general. So John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, then John didn't bring beer, and he didn't bring wine to the party. So I'm going to call this a conjunctive entailment. Now, Mandarin doesn't work like this at all, surprisingly. So the Mandarin disjunction word is huojia, and negated disjunctions fail to generate a conjunctive entailment in Mandarin. The same is true of Japanese, Turkish, Italian, Russian, and we've looked at all these languages, as I'll show you later. So if you say, John didn't bring beer or wine to the party in Mandarin Chinese, where negation is meo, and pizhou, huojia, hengzhou is wine or beer or wine, then it means it's beer or wine that John didn't bring to the party. So it doesn't mean he didn't bring beer and he didn't bring wine. It means he either didn't bring beer or he didn't bring wine or he didn't bring either one. So it's one of them or both of them that he didn't bring. But when we say he didn't bring beer or wine to the party in English, it means he didn't bring either one, right? Okay, so this is the way a lot of languages work. Okay, so I'm going to make a couple of technical distinctions here just so I can continue to discuss this. So I'm going to assume that disjunction is a positive polarity item. Now, positive polarity items, by definition, are logical words that have to take scope over negation. They cannot be interpreted within the scope of negation. So I think in Mandarin, the disjunction word huojia is a positive polarity item. It has to be interpreted outside the scope of negation. And that's why we use a cleft structure. We say it's either beer or wine that John didn't bring, because the beer or wine takes scope over negation. John didn't bring beer or wine to the party. It's beer or wine that he didn't bring to the party. So we would use a cleft structure if we wanted to capture that interpretation in English. So even though Mandarin Chinese and English look like they have the same word order, it looks like on the surface negation takes scope over disjunction, so meo takes scope over huojia. Appearances are deceiving at the level of interpretation. You have to interpret the huojia phrase as taking scope over negation. Whereas in English, what you see is what you get. A disjunction is not a positive polarity item. It can just be interpreted in its surface position in English. So if you say John didn't bring beer or wine, then he didn't bring beer or wine, didn't bring beer, and he didn't bring wine. So English disjunction is not a positive polarity item. Okay, so I propose that there's a parameter. This is just the way languages differ. There's a parameter, and children have to learn the value of that parameter that is attested in the local language that they're speaking. So the value of the disjunction parameter where or takes scope over negation, I'll call that plus PPI, plus positive polarity item. Huoja is a positive polarity item, it's plus PPI. If it just is interpreted in situ, in its position, in the surface syntax, then it's minus PPI. It's not a positive polarity item. Okay, so that's the difference. So English disjunction is minus PPI. If you say John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, then negation takes scope over disjunction. Mandarin disjunction is positive polarity item. If you say John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, then the beer or wine phrase takes scope over the Mayo phrase at the level of interpretation. So it's Pizhou, Huoja, Hangzhou that John didn't bring to the party. Okay, so this is the way I'm going to account for this cross-linguistic difference, is by invoking this parameter, this disjunction parameter, and this will explain how different languages work. Now I want to just very briefly convince you that it's not just there's two words for disjunction in human languages. So lots of people over the past 40 or 50 years have claimed that, well, disjunction is just ambiguous. In some languages, it's inclusive disjunction, and in other languages, exclusive disjunction. So you could think that Mandarin Huoja is just exclusive disjunction, but you'd be wrong to think that, and it's very simple to see why. Suppose that we use this formula, we use this symbol for exclusive or. Well, if A or B, if it's A exclusive or B, well then just one of them is true, right? So if or is exclusive or in Mandarin or Italian or Irish or something, then if you say A or B, then it's either A or B, but not both A and B, right? Now, if we negate that, then the sentence will be false if it's just one of them is true. But recall that if I say John didn't bring beer or wine to the party in Mandarin Chinese, it's true if he didn't bring one of them. So it can't be exclusive disjunction, right? It just wouldn't meet the truth conditions of exclusive disjunction. Okay, so if it's not exclusive disjunction, then what is it? Well, I'm going to assume it's a parameter. Now the next assumption is that children initially favor the same parametric default setting of the parameter. So this is right out of chapter 1 in Chomsky's book, that children will often start with all the parameters set to their sort of default settings, or they can randomly choose which ones to set which way, but that children will start off the same. In fact, this is sort of the definition of the theory of universal grammar. It's the child's initial guess at what the human language that they're learning is, and then they'll experience differences, the ways in which human languages can differ, and they'll change and become adults. So adults look quite different, but children should always look the same. And for scope interpretations, it's clear that for disjunction, the subset reading, or the child's initial guess, should be the English setting of the parameter. So or should be minus PPI, as in English. So this predicts that Mandarin-speaking children should speak a fragment of English. So when they're, and also Russian-speaking children and Japanese-speaking children and Italian-speaking children, they should all start off speaking English for this particular parameter. There'll be other parameters, which I won't have time to talk about, where it's just the opposite, that children who are learning English should start off speaking Mandarin Chinese. This is fully crossed linguistic phenomena. But for Huoja, Mandarin-speaking children are expected to interpret negated sentences in the same way as English-speaking children interpret them. Okay, so even though this interpretation is not attested in the language of adults. Okay, so these are the predictions. That's Kermit the Frog. He's making the predictions. So English disjunction is minus PPI. So if you say, for adults, John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, it means he didn't bring beer and he didn't bring wine. For child English, it's the same. John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, it means he didn't bring beer and he didn't bring wine to the party. So I guess we can talk about beer and wine for our children. Mandarin disjunction is minus PPI for children, but it's plus PPI for adults. So the idea is children have the same default value as English-speaking children and adults, but they'll differ from adult speakers of English. So adult Mandarin speakers, if you say, John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, that will mean it's beer or wine that John didn't bring to the party, but I don't know which one he didn't bring, right? But for children, they should just speak English. So they should think John didn't bring beer or wine to the party means John didn't bring beer and he didn't bring wine to the party. Okay, now how do we test this prediction? And again, it's not just a prediction about Mandarin Chinese, but a prediction about all human languages. They all start off the same. The theory of universal grammar, Chomsky 1965, suggests that children will all start off the same, then they'll set the parameters and the languages will become different. Well, we test it using some variation of a truth value judgment task. It was developed by Goro and Akiba in 2004. And I'll give you a version of this task. This is something very simple that you can make up this booklet very easily and include it in your kit. So we act out short vignettes. It's just in a little booklet in front of the child and Kermit the Frog. It's all about animals who are asked to eat their vegetables and also to eat cake. Now here's the rules of the game. If an animal eats both of his vegetables, well, then he gets a good prize, a gold medal. If he eats only one vegetable, he gets a lesser prize, a blue medal. And if he eats neither one of his vegetables, he gets a black cross. A black cross in Japanese is not a very good thing to get. Now, the vegetables are all removed. This is where the Velcro comes into the game. The vegetables are all removed, and Kermit attempts to guess what each animal had eaten in turn based on the medal that it is wearing around its neck. And on the critical trials, and the only ones I'll go into, are ones in which the animal is wearing a blue medal. So he'd eaten one of the vegetables. Okay, so here's the game again. 12 animals. They're offered 3 kinds of food. Depending on what they eat, they get a reward. Kermit the Frog guesses what the animal ate based on the prize, the medal. Okay, here's how the story goes. There's a little test, so pay attention to this now. So these animals are going to play an eating game, and there's Kermit the Frog, and he's looking at one of the animals in the eating game. Now, here's a piece of cake and a green pepper and a carrot. Now, all of the animals love the cake, and they're all going to eat the cake. But not all of them like the vegetables. So here's a rule. If the animal eats not only the cake, but also the vegetables, he gets a good prize. Okay, so if somebody eats the cake, the pepper, also the carrot, they get a gold medal. So here's the rules being explained to the child. If someone eats the cake and one of the vegetables, the carrot, the pepper, but not both, gets a blue medal. If he eats the cake, but he leaves the carrot and the pepper behind, then he gets the black cross. Okay? Now you've been taught the game, and now the child and you will play the game together. So here comes the pig. He wants to play the game. Now he picks up the cake. He loves the cake, and of course he eats the cake. And now he picks up the pepper, but he didn't like the pepper, but he managed to eat the pepper. Okay, but he picks up the carrot and he says, no, that's enough vegetables. I just managed to eat that pepper. I'm not going to eat the carrot. Okay, now this is the test. What medal does he get? This is a real test. Blue medal, right? See, even adults can play this game, and kids enjoy the game quite a lot. Yes, it's a blue medal, so that's what he gets. And now you know the rules of the game, and so we can proceed with this. And every 3-year-old child loves this game. It's very quick and easy to run. So here's another animal. Now we have 12 animals. Every one of the animals eats the cake. 4 of them eat both the vegetables. They get the gold medal. 4 eat only one vegetable. They get the blue medal. 4 eat neither vegetable. They get the black cross. Now after the game is over, all the vegetables are removed, and the medals are on the animals, right? And now Kermit decides to try to remember what each of the characters ate. He says, okay, I'm going to tell you what they ate. I can't remember the details of what they ate, but he has a blue medal, okay? So then he produces the test sentence. So here are the predictions again. Mandarin disjunction is positive polarity item for adults, but it's not a positive polarity item for children. Therefore, if you say the pig ate the carrot or the pepper, it means it's the carrot or the pepper that the pig ate, right? So if he has a blue medal and it says it's the carrot or the pepper that the pig ate, then is Kermit right? Yes, right? He has a blue medal, so it's the carrot or the pepper. Oh, it's the carrot or the pepper that he didn't eat. It's the carrot or the pepper that he didn't eat, but he could have eaten the other one, so he gets a blue medal. But for children, we're expecting them to interpret the same sentence, the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper, to mean he didn't eat either one, and therefore, if we say the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper, it should mean he didn't eat the carrot and he didn't eat the pepper, then he shouldn't have the blue medal. He should have the black cross. So this is false for children, right? So that's the predictions, very simple test. Okay, and what are the results? Well, if you say the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper, and he has the blue medal, the pig has the blue medal, adults say yes 95% of the time. Mandarin-speaking adults accept this 95% of the time. But Mandarin-speaking children reject it 97% of the time. They say, no, he did eat one, that's why he has the blue medal, right? And when they justify their rejections, Kermit pointed out that the animals had eaten one of the vegetables, that's why he has the blue medal. Okay, now we haven't just looked at this in Mandarin and in English. We've looked at it in 7 languages. 3 of them are languages like English. One of them is German, another one is Korean. And in German and Korean, and like in English, if you say the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper, it means he didn't eat the carrot and he didn't eat the pepper, so he ate neither one. And that's what children think that sentence means, so they reject the blue medal condition in Korean, in German, and in English, and so do adults. So on the right-hand side, you see that the pattern of rejections is exactly the same for children and adults in the blue medal condition. Now, we looked at 4 languages in which the claim is that disjunction is a positive polarity item. It's the carrot or the pepper that the pig didn't eat. Therefore, for adults, it should be accepted in the blue medal condition, but for children, it should be rejected by children learning any human language. So we should get a big difference between adults and children in these languages. These languages include Turkish, Chinese, Japanese, and Russian. And 2 of these studies were done not in our lab, but by other labs in both Russian and in Korean, actually. And what you see is exactly what's predicted. So children will say no, but adults say yes when disjunction is a positive polarity item in those 4 languages, but when disjunction is not a positive polarity item, then both children and adults say no. So this conforms to the predictions of Kermit the Frog and the theory of universal grammar, that children start off with the initial setting of this disjunction parameter, which makes sentences true in the narrowest range of circumstances. Therefore, they'll have positive evidence available to them if they're learning a language like Turkish or Japanese or Mandarin Chinese, in which sentences like the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper are true if it's the carrot or the pepper that the pig didn't eat. Okay, so that's one of the ways in which human languages can differ that conform to the predictions of the theory of universal grammar by embodying logical scope relations in terms of lexical parameters. So the idea is that hoja or ka, Japanese ka, is just a lexical parameter. It can either take scope over negation or not, but children all initially take that disjunction to be interpreted inside the scope of negation, just like in English or German or Korean. But that brings out a big difference between children and adults, and it's a difference that's not expected or explained on a theory of information structure. So the last example I want to turn to is where children differ from adults due to a genetic disorder. And this has been studied by Mabel Rice at University of Kansas and with her colleagues, Ken Wexler and others. And this is, the argument is about principle C, but in fact, the case that I'm going to study has nothing to do with principle C. But the argument goes, Well, Principle C, theory of universal grammar, says this is an abstract syntactic constraint. So if you say a sentence like, he said the troll was the best jumper, then the he cannot be the troll, right? So if you have a sentence like, he said the troll is the best jumper, and I've studied this since 1984, so for a long, long time, children by the age of 3 know that the pronoun he cannot be the troll. So it can't mean the troll thinks that he is the best jumper. Now, according to the theory of universal grammar, this is a very abstract syntactic constraint. When you have two noun phrases that are in a certain structural relation called C command, then when the pronoun has C commands this name or definite description, they have to receive different indices. Different noun phrases with different indices have to be interpreted as distinct in reference. They have to be disjoint in reference. The sentence is okay as long as they have different indices. So if you say, he said the troll was the best jumper, that's a fine sentence of English, any other language, but it just means the he is somebody else. Now, there is a pragmatic alternative that these people, Ambridge and Liebman, suggest. But I want to suggest to you that it's a little bit complicated. So here's the alternative. So you thought that Principle C was complicated. Okay, well, here's the alternative. If the speakers use a pronoun as the topic of the main assertion of a sentence, he said X, he cannot use a lexical NP in a clause that provides background information, what he said, to refer to that same entity. Now, that needs independent evidence that speakers consider the content of reported speech to be background evidence to some extent, and they say the verb say is moderately backgrounding in another part. So this is their story, right? Now, what's the evidence that children know this constraint? Well, here's another quote. The evidence is that even 3-year-olds understand the discourse functional constraints that govern the use of pronouns versus full NPs. And they give a study of this. They conclude that studies that demonstrate apparent adherence to Principle C at this age, at 3, do not constitute evidence that children must necessarily be using this formal syntactic principle as opposed to discourse function. Okay, well, what is the study that they do? Well, they do 2 conditions. They do a condition in which they name the actor. So in condition 1, they say, was that the clown? Oh, what happened? And in another condition, they don't name the actor. They name just what's taking place, or they just gesture to what's taking place. Say, that sounds like fun. What happened? Right? Now, in both of the stories, there's a clown and it's performing some action. Right? So what they predict then, if children are sensitive to previous mention in discourse, we expect them to respond to the first question, what happened, with a pronoun. Was that the clown? Oh, what happened? He, was blowing a balloon. Okay. But in the second condition, they should use a full noun phrase. That sounds like fun. What happened? The clown was blowing a balloon. Okay? That's the prediction of the study, and that's exactly what happened, right? Now, everyone agrees, so here's the argument against more than one method again. Everyone agrees that you need these sorts of pragmatic principles, and they must be added to any formal account that deals with other cases to explain the entire pattern of data. So the syntactic principle, and here's what I take issue with. The syntactic principle restates the pragmatic principle that one cannot pronominalize from the part of the sentence that contains the main assertion into a part of the sentence that contains only background information. That doesn't look very much like Principle C to me. Principle C says if you have a referring expression, the troll, it's C commanded by a pronoun, must be disjoint in reference. It doesn't say one cannot pronominalize from the part of the sentence that contains the main assertion, he said, into a part of the sentence that contains only background information. But let's not worry about this, because whenever we do these studies since 1984, we've always provided linguistic antecedent. And we did this in order to avoid type 1 errors. So whenever we had a sentence like, he said that the troll was the best jumper, what we did is we always name the cast of characters, right? We would say that, okay, this was a story and it was about RoboCop and the people who were attempting to jump over things, and one of them was the troll. And he said that the troll was the last jumper. So what we do is we mention the potential referent of the pronoun as the last named noun phrase in the story. And we mention the referent of the pronoun. We mentioned that last, and we mentioned the non-troll, the RoboCop or whoever was the judge. We mentioned that first. Okay, so if recency of mention guides the selection of the referent and pronoun, then this favors the illicit interpretation. Okay, so there are two accounts. One is principle C, as it's an abstract syntactic principle. Another is that children just know when they should use pronouns and when they should use names. And if they know this, well, then they are well underway to learning the language of the local linguistic community. But in fact, that's not the case. So what we've been studying, and this is a study by Kelly Rambo in our lab, is that children who are learning language slower, at a much slower pace than normally developing children, actually may know about pronouns and names at a stage at which they're not processing language in the same way that adults are. So again, the differences between child language and adult language can be revealing about the seams of human languages in ways in which, if you were just developing language typically and you're getting everything right, then you may not differ from adults. Now, specific language impairment is a developmental disorder that targets language without any loss, such as hearing loss or general intelligence. SLI is highly heritable, so there is a genetic cause. We just don't know at the moment what it is. Children with SLI fall within normal limits in nonverbal IQ and other cognitive abilities, but they produce very simplified grammatical constructions. And the one that Mabel Rice and Ken Wexler and others have been focusing on the most is the absence of tense. So they often will omit tense. Now, it's not that they delete it altogether, they omit tense all the time, but it seems more optional than it does for adult speakers and for young children. So for children with specific language impairment, they'll often leave out the copular verb is, for example, and that's what I'm going to report. Okay, so what Rombau did was she investigated knowledge of these discourse principles, and then she did a test of their tense omission in children with SLI. Okay, so she did the same sort of study that was done by the Ambridge and Levin group. She would mention the NP in one question, and she would not mention the NP in another question. So she would say, well, what's the clown doing? And when you say, what's the clown doing? 3-year-olds will use a pronoun, that's in the dark band here. 5-year-olds will use a pronoun slightly less often than 3-year-olds, but still way more often than lexical noun phrases. And SLI children will use pronouns, right? However, if you don't mention the clown in the question, you just say, who's blowing up the balloon, then you see with 3-year-olds, the proportion of noun phrases, the clown is blowing up the balloon, or just the clown, that goes up. And SLI children look just like 5-year-olds. So they know this discourse constraint far better even than 3-year-olds do. So when it comes to knowledge of these discourse constraints, SLI children are perfectly normal, at least with this particular constraint. Yeah, they're not normal with all pragmatic constraints, obviously, but with this particular constraint, they're perfectly normal. And yet, when you look at SLI children's omission of the copular verb to be in their sentences, they look like 3-year-olds. So they're delayed by about 2 years. 5-year-olds do not omit tense in long, complicated sentences. Whenever they're describing what the clown is doing, they say the clown is blowing up the balloon. 3-year-olds omit tense about 20% of the time, and children with SLI omit tense even more than that, about 30% of the time. So we get this disconnect again, this dissociation. Children with SLI have no problems in the use of pronouns, and lexical NPs. So they're perfectly normal, just as good as 5-year-olds or 3-year-olds at using pronouns to refer back to some event where a particular character like the clown has been mentioned, but they'll use a lexical noun phrase when just an action is mentioned. However, when it comes to tense, SLI children are quite different from normal, age-matched 5-year-old children. So these SLI children are 5, right? So they look a lot like 3-year-olds. And for some aspects of morphology, you have to actually go back to look at 2-year-olds to see the same characteristic pattern as SLI children. So SLI children have a particular grammatical deficit. It's not a deficit in the ability to use a pronoun to refer back to something that's been named in a prior discourse, or to use a lexical noun phrase to go back if there hasn't been any particular individual mentioned in a prior discourse. However, when it comes to putting in grammatical morphemes like the past tense ed, or using the copular verb, SLI children are a lot like 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds. They're not deviant in any way. All the structures that normally developing children go through, all the non-adult structures that 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds go through, all the mistakes that 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds make with tense, SLI children make exactly those same errors, and then they recover rapidly when they learn certain grammatical morphemes, just in the way that 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds do. But their language delayed, and what is delayed is a specific aspect of language, and it's not information structure. So to conclude, the argument against more than one method was an argument about typically developing children. So it was that a theory of information structure can give a more parsimonious account of how typically developing children learn to become adults. And the argument goes that, well, we can explain all the adult phenomena using information structure. We can explain it also using abstract properties like C command and syntactic properties and semantic properties and so on. We can explain the same data using both of those theories, but we need some pragmatic principles independently. So when kids are developing language normally, it's more parsimonious to explain their developmental course of language acquisition using information structure rather than the theory of universal grammar. And my counterargument is simple as this. That's okay as an argument, setting aside whether it's true or not. That's okay as an argument, but it ignores all the differences between child language and adult language. And when we look across languages, or when we look at specific genetic disorders, what we see are differences that don't look as though they're going to be explained by a theory of information structure. The differences look as though they require some of the operating principles that are embedded within the theory of universal grammar. And I gave 2 examples of this. One is where the difference between children and adults across languages is a matter of scope. The interpretation of disjunction in negative sentences across languages varies, but children always start off the same. They always start off with the same scope assignments. The English or German or Korean assignment in which disjunction is interpreted inside the scope of negation. And that's true of Japanese-speaking children, of Mandarin, Chinese-speaking children, of Russian-speaking children, of Turkish-speaking children. And that's quite remarkable, given that there's no evidence for that interpretation from adult speakers of those languages, and yet children start off in the same way, just as Chomsky had predicted about 50 years ago in aspects of the theory of syntax. And another place in which children differ from adults in ways that have been described by abstract syntactic principles is when there's a specific language impairment, when children are not suffering from a hearing loss or absence, a deficit in general knowledge, but they seem to suffer from a delay in certain aspects of syntax, in grammatical morphology. So when we look at the differences between child language and the language of adults, then we see that these differences can be explained not by the theory of information structure, but we actually have to invoke some of the principles of the theory of universal grammar. If that's the case, then it takes more than one method for children to acquire their mother tongue. That's it. Thanks.